everybody. Thank you for coming out to our lovely event today to protect every child, and hosted by the Stop It Foundation and Protect Every Child, as well as Child Friendly Faith Project. And we'd like to welcome you here, and we have the barbecue as well as a hike for those who can make the hike. You're more than welcome to hike up Lone Mountain. And first of all, we're going to start off with our first speaker, Jan Heimlich.
Thank you, Teresa. And thank you to the Bresee family for having me here. I live in Austin, Texas, and I just didn't feel like we had enough heat there, so I thought I would come to Las Vegas. No, I think we all know why we're here, and I want to first acknowledge that everybody here is a hero courage, because we're talking about things that a lot of folks have a difficult time discussing. You may or may not know that I started a nonprofit organization called the Child Friendly Faith Project, and we're a national 501c3 that raises awareness of religious child abuse and neglect. And we've been doing this for some time. We started in 2012. This happened after I wrote a book called Breaking Their Will. And it's really the first book that takes an in-depth look at religious child maltreatment. When I first was talking about the issue, it was kind of a lonely road, but I think that a lot of people in this country have realized that there are some serious problems that exist in religious organizations. Now, they're not in every religious organization, but it is important to understand what the risk factors are, because different religious communities are governed in different ways. Now, I had the pleasure about 6 months ago to get to know Brian Bresee. He had, and his family, suffered a tragic loss when his son Samuel took his own life. This family had been part of the LDS community, an organization, for a long time. Brian is 6th generation Mormon. What Brian was willing to look at, something that very, very few parents have the courage to do, which is not just to talk about how his son made that end-of-life decision, but why, and how the influences, while there are many different contributing factors to teen suicide, we do know teen suicide is a really big problem, but it's especially a big problem in states where there are a lot of people of the Mormon faith. And so we can't just turn a blind eye to that. And Brian and I worked for quite a long time on a very important article that appeared on our website, and it discusses how Samuel made that choice largely because of LDS teachings that affected him, and his son wrote about this himself, and the whole family, and I venture to say communities as well. I was talking to Brian's daughter, Sarah, and I asked her a very important question, and she gave me a very insightful answer. My question was, what do you think is important to say about children's rights? And she said, we should all be allowed to have our own path. That is something that you will not hear said and meant in certain, what I call religious authoritarian communities. And this is a topic I've researched a lot, and really tried to get at the bottom of, when are faith communities harmful for children? Because many of them are not. Many of them allow children to thrive and be who they are and explore and not feel shame and guilt and things like that. And so, I won't bore you with my research results or anything like that, but I do think it's important to understand that, just as in any abuse or neglect case, the most common people who are behind it are parents. in religious communities where they're very authoritarian, something really harmful happens, and that is parents are victims too. And they are robbed of autonomy and decision-making power and the ability to make decisions for their kids. And what unfortunately happens, and why children are so vulnerable and unprotected, is that sometimes religious leaders and organizations sort of create a wedge in families where they just don't belong. So with that, I started to learn about something called middle manager parents. And that is something that I've seen occur many, many, many times in the LDS Church and many other religious organizations where there's fear of just allowing families to be the loving, great communities that they are. So with that, I think I will hand it over to Brian, and you're the next on the list, I think, right, Brian? And I just want to thank everyone again for coming out, and I'm really looking forward to our hike. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jan. As you all heard, Brian's going to go ahead and give us a little introduction and a little speech of his own.
Okay, sure.
Thank you, Teresa. Well, I'm here today to try to promote a safe environment, a religious environment. A good religion can be a place to find community, tradition, family, a meaning for life, and a sense of belonging. These are all very good things. And the reality is, I myself have partaken of some of these sweet fruits, even within our former church that did so much harm to our family. You know, I still participate in religion. I still believe there's some good things there. And the reality is my faith in God is still very strong. That's not changed in the faith journey I've been in since my son ended his own life. You know, early on, when the church leaders came to our house, I told them that there were some unsafe things in the church that needed to be addressed. So this has always been my goal. And I know some might attribute that to other motives, but it really is to help make religion good instead of harmful, and make it a protective factor against teen suicide. Again, I believe religion can be a protective factor against teen suicide if it's a good religion. Like with our family, the religious experience of many has gone terribly wrong. As described by Jan, the speaker who previous to me, I became a middle manager parent for church leaders, which ended in great harm to my 14-year-old son, Samuel, his end-of-life decision. Like the majority of parents did from our previous church, I required Samuel to participate in church activity, very common in my previous church. And this was a place where he found abuse and great harm to his mental health. I've kind of narrowed it down to 5 points of harmful religion that is damaging the mental health of children and, truthfully, some adults as well. I'm going to take it in order as I see it, how it harmed my son. The first point is worthiness interviews. These are interviews that ask children all kinds of sexual questions that bring shame upon them and bring a sense of self-loathing upon them. Mental health professionals clearly state that these types of interviews damage the sense of worth for the children that are participating in them. The only exception to that is that maybe there are some children, actually maybe more than we'd like to acknowledge, that lie during these interviews. So it's probably not harming them. But the children that are conscientious and speak the truth and take the truth serious are the ones that will be the most harmed by these worthiness interviews that test to see if a child is worthy or clean and sadly, the types of questions that are being asked are sexual, masturbation as one is the more harmful questions, but it even gets worse from there. You know, shortly after my son had his first worthiness interview, I did notice a change in him at that time. Before, he was much more open about discussing all things, but I remember him and I was driving him to a school for a band thing for his instrument, and I remember somehow the topic of sex came up, and it's a father-son moment, birds and bees moment, and unlike before, this time he became very resistant to even talk about anything sexual. And for me it was confusing, but I couldn't quite understand what was going on. I didn't realize the damage. The damage is there's been thousands of people testify that these types of worthiness interviews damaged their mental health to the point of almost suicide. There's thousands of testimonies of this occurring. You know, the interviews that my son went to, obviously I wasn't in that room because it's a one-on-one interview with the bishop, and so how do I really know what went on? But I somewhat do know. And how do I know that? Because at the funeral, guess who spoke at the funeral? The very first bishop to interview him and the very last bishop to interview him. And they actually testified. Maybe they didn't understand what they were doing, but I remember. And they told me that when they did bishops' interviews, this was both the very first bishop to interview him and the very last one before he died. Both of them agreed that he was very conscientious during those interviews, and he was very slow to answer the questions, significantly different than others that they had interviewed. So this gives some insight on how my son responded to these interviews that were probing into his sexual life, things like masturbation. A second harm that is found in religious organizations is there's abuse and bullying there. I myself view some of the questions that are being asked during these worthiness interviews as a form of childhood sexual abuse. And as I went and I researched this, I was not an expert on childhood sexual abuse, but there's one point that just rang a bell for me as I researched childhood sexual abuse. And they became very fearful to talk about anything sexual. Some do, not all. Some of the children who have been exposed to that. And that is exactly what happened to my son after he did those worthiness interviews. So I view it as a form of childhood sexual abuse. The second thing that happened to my son was serious bullying. And that kind of ties in with the third one, the third problem with harmful church. The most harmful thing that I believe contributed to my son's end-of-life decision is they were calling him faggot at church, which they spread to his school, and it went online as well. So we have chat logs. So the problem is the church does not address bullying. And you might ask why. Because people go to church with the same people every week, and let's suppose you find one child bullying another and you confront the child. Now, if their parents are not understanding, their parents are bullies too. Now you have to go to church every week with an angry parent because you told them that their child was abusing others, sadly. So, and this could go on for years. So most people will choose often their self instead of protecting the child in this situation. After my son's abuse started, this guy takes us to the number 4 thing that harmed my son's mental health and is not good in religion. As soon as his abuse started, he started to go through a faith crisis. As soon as his peers were calling him faggot and hazing and mocking him, which we have witnesses and evidence of that, he started to wonder if this was the true church, if there was a belief in God. He started to right away. It was about 3 to 4 weeks, well documented in chat logs. Before that abuse began, he was always supportive of church, always supportive of religion, 100 ever, all the way up to the day the abuse started. After that abuse started, 3 to 4 weeks later, that started to break down. A church that doesn't give you room to explore new ideas, that threatens you with excommunication, disfellowship, or shunning, is harmful. You know, I have a friend. He's an adult, and he's not much younger than me. And he had a family man, kids. It was about 6 months ago, and I ran into him at a restaurant, and I said, well, how you been? And he told me that he has not been very good. And he said the reason why is because he was starting to go through a faith crisis. And this faith crisis took him to the edge of suicide, according to him. People are suffering because they have beliefs that no longer align with the church, the harmful church they're in. And now it's pitting them, their conscience, against their fellowship with their own family. We know that when you damage the connectiveness of anybody, especially a child, you are damaging and risking a suicide. Suicide experts say one of the key factors is connectiveness. If you can maintain that for a child, a teen, you can reduce their teen suicide. And most teen suicide prevention programs are centered around that concept. But now you're telling a child that, hey, you don't no longer believe as maybe the family believes or the church believes. And now they start to find a shunning, they start to find a disfellowship, and possibly the threat of excommunication. This is extremely harmful to be found in a religion, and if we want to reduce teen suicides within a religious context, they have got to quit threatening people, children, with during their faith crisis with damaged connectiveness. And really, the last thing that the harmful church will do, and we want to turn this around to good churches, because I still believe good churches are a protective factor, is they got to quit covering up abuse. You know, just imagine, especially if you're a young victim, you're powerless. You can't go and your parents may not even believe you too. And you've been seriously harmed, and you have nowhere to go. And now your church leader is also going to turn against you because they don't want to maybe upset the aggressive parents. They maybe a good tithe payer, right? The aggressive child has a great tithe paying parent. Don't want to upset them, do we? They might even be the bishop's son, which is often the case. They don't want to upset any of that power structure. And there's also liability concerns. They don't want to explore that abuse because they might expose negligence on the part of the church. You know, that is what happened to us after we lost a son to suicide, is they became very, very defensive, aggressive towards us. And truthfully, at the day before I lost my son to suicide, guess what? We did go to church that day. I did have a calling. I did pay my tithing. Did have a temple recommend. So I was living the Mormon life. But then to turn around and have them aggressively come at us because I was seeking for a correction for those who harmed my son, to have that on top of my son's suicide was I went through a faith crisis on top of my son's suicide. I have to tell you, that was one of the hardest things. It put me on the edge, very harmful, and it's putting children on the edge. You cover up their abuse, you're damaging a suicide. Risking a suicide. Good churches don't do this. They don't cover up abuse. They ask questions and they correct those involved, no matter the cost. And sadly, there's too many churches that are not doing this, bad churches. We need to encourage a change. Did you know that during the last couple of days, even the last hours of my son's life, that he was on chat rooms and he was talking to people, and during those chats he was expressing how deeply upset he was over his abuse at church, going to church. And you know, I was one of those middle manager parents that Jan spoke about, and I was doing what I was instructed and make the kids go to church. And although I did tell them, look, as soon as you turn 15, you can start choosing for it yourself. Parenting is a process of slowly letting go. But he was 14 and he was in the middle of some serious abuse, and his mental health was being seriously harmed through interviews as well. And it just wasn't in time. You know, I spent the longest time wondering, why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he come and tell me? And when you lose a child to suicide, the guilt that goes with that, any suicide really, is immense. And I asked, why didn't he come and tell me? And I came to understand there's an embarrassment barrier that comes for victims, rape victims, all kinds of victims. You can get mugged or whatever, and you're too embarrassed to tell anybody. But within the Mormon world we came from, being called faggot is, I don't know about anybody else in this crowd, but I know I never would have told my parents that wasn't happening to me. And he came to me and he told me about some of the small things that were happening, but they seemed, they're making me pass sacrament or something small. But he was, and I could see him, he came to, and I could see him trying to tell me the bigger thing, being called faggot every day. And it just never quite came out. And during those last hours of his life on the chat logs, he was telling him how his church was harming him and his parents were making him go. And some of the people on there began to say, call the police and get some help. And another person was an adult, and he said, why don't you give me your information and I'll call the police for you. But this was a children's website, so obviously that's forbidden to give out personal information. So this man was not able to help him. And he was too afraid to call the police himself. The barriers to do that were just too high. You know something? I wished he had called the police. I wished he had called the police. Because, he would still be alive, maybe, if he had. I wish that other person could have got his information and called the police on me as his parent for making him go to church, to a place that was harming his mental health. A clear path for children to ask for help is needed. We need to lower the embarrassment barriers for children asking for help. And that's the reason why today we're going to announce that with the participation of others, the Stop It Foundation is drafting federal legislation that will provide a nationwide hotline for victims of bullying and childhood sexual abuse, a clear place to ask for help. I wonder if my son would still be alive if he had that. This hotline receives reports of abuse, no limits to where the abuse occurred. Churches, leagues, scouts, home, anywhere. As an example, the new law passed by Nevada, the Safe to Tell bill, actually something that Teresa and I went to Carson City to lobby for to help get passed. It's a good step in the right direction, but guess what? It's only limited to abuse in and around schools. And that's great. It was a great step up in protecting children, giving them a place to ask for help. But it would not have helped my sons with this abuse at church. What if he was at a league? He was actually at Scouts at church when the abuse began. Wouldn't have helped him at Scouts either, this hotline. We want to put no limits on where this abuse occurred. Could be at the home as well. a lot of abuse occurs there, even within the family. That needs to be a safe place for a child to ask for help. How many women have been abused by their own family as children, childhood sexual abuse, and they don't have a clear path to ask for help? That needs to change with a legislation. My notes are getting kind of scrambled here. Did you know that 1 in 10 children are dropping out of school for one reason? It's bullying. And what I'm finding is childhood sexual abuse has the same type of numbers. Abuse. And when you have a child that's not educated because they dropped out of school and now they're needing services because they can't make a good paycheck, who's going to pay for that? Any guesses? Call it out. The taxpayer's going to pay for that. That's right. That's right. Did you know that abuse, and when I say abuse, I'm going to say bullying and childhood sexual abuse is what that means. Abuse can permanently damage the mental health of a child. And these are recent studies that are coming out within the last 5 to 10 years. And they did a bunch of research, and they thought, oh, well, once the abuse goes away, the child will go back to normal. Everything will be great, right? It's just a temporary thing. It's not the case. That abuse leads to permanent anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, all kinds of things that don't go away when the abuse goes away. It stays with them. And now this person's going to need services from mental health professionals if they're lucky. And who's going to pay for that? You're going to pay for it. That's right, the taxpayer. Yes. Did you know that abuse increases drug usage for both the victim and the perpetrator? And now we have people on drugs, and they're going to rehab, and they're having all kinds of health problems. And who's going to pay for that? Are they going to have money? A lot of times, no. Anybody? That's right. The taxpayer is going to pay for that. Did you know that abuse increases teen suicide attempts? Did you know that for every completed teen suicide, there's 20 attempts? And what normally happens after an attempted suicide? They go to the hospital. That is correct. And who's going to pay for that?
Us, the taxpayer.
That's right. You're going to pay for it. Taxpayer is. Did you know that abuse is a major contributor in over 50% of teen suicides, the second leading cause of death for teenagers? And that's a reality that's lived, and it hurts. And there's no price for that. There's no price tag on the death of a child because they were being abused. You know, society already recognizes that children do not have the reasoning skills of an adult. That's why we have a juvenile system instead of an adult system. They separate those for a reason, and a good reason. As such, when a child does not know where to ask for help, because they don't have the same reasoning skills as an adult, they don't know they can call the police. It's not clear to them. And maybe they're afraid of the police. They don't know where to go. Their civil right, when the child does not know where to ask for help, their civil right of equal protection is denied. We have a constitution of equal protection. But when a child does not have a clear path to find protection from their abuse, their path, civil right of equal protection is denied. Protecting children from abuse is a civil rights issue. As such, the federal government must take on the task of providing children with the clearest path to obtaining their civil right of equal protection and providing them with a safe voice for all children hotline, which does two very simple things. And there are other hotlines out there, but they're not federal. They don't have the authority of the federal government, and they don't have the funding They're struggling and they're always begging for money, trying to gather money. It should not be. It should be the federal government paying for this, not a nonprofit struggling to make this happen. And this hotline does two very simple things. And I've spent years pondering this because I've lived this, actually, lived it. The most important thing we can do to reduce the abuse of children is to separate the reporting of that abuse from those who are supposed to address it. Okay? Because what will often happen if the person who's supposed to be addressing it is also the same person it's being reported to? And they're going to a lot of times sweep it under the rug. And sometimes that ends in tragic consequences. And sometimes it's their fear of the perpetrator. Adults are sometimes afraid of children. Or they're afraid of their parents. Maybe the adult's too lazy, they're busy, they have a busy work schedule and they can't be bothered. This is another big one. They view abuse as kids just being kids, with the victims that just need to toughen up. And sadly, that is more prevalent belief than you could ever imagine out there amongst adults. And with that, that's being used as an excuse for adult to just walk away and let life-changing and life-ending abuse occur. We can't put this reporting of abuse in the hands of those who are supposed to be addressing it anymore. To illustrate this, I'm going to tell you a story that happened right here in this valley. You might have heard about it. The Lambert family. They had a 13-year-old daughter. She was being abused at school. And she went to the principal, the counselor, dean, on 2 or 3 occasions, and she said, "Look, I'm being abused. I need help." And guess who was supposed to be addressing that abuse as well? The same people it was reported to. And guess what? It did not get addressed. Not long after, Haley Lambert ended her own life in her own notes because of that abuse. Her father, Jason Lambert, went to the school and said, "Well, did she ever report the abuse? Was there any reports of her abuse?" And what do you think their answer to that question was? No, there was no reports of abuse. So, about a month later, he gets a letter in the mail, an anonymous letter, actually, and it says, "You better ask them again because they're not telling you the truth." She did report it on multiple occasions. So he goes back to the school right here in this valley, Clark County School District, and he said, "I've got an anonymous tip that you do have reports of her abuse," and finally they disclosed, "Yes, we did indeed get reports of abuse, and we did nothing to protect your daughter, and we didn't let you know it was happening either." What do you think that turned into? It turned into a lawsuit, which actually it went on for years, but they finally just got a payout for that. The school district lost that. So you have organizations that don't want a reporting process at all, because if they have a report on record and the organization does nothing to address that abuse, what has it just done for the organization? It's increased their liability. So the safest legal position is for an organization to do nothing, to not have any reporting process, to have nothing on record.
No, that's terrible.
That's the safest legal position. It is terrible. What this new hotline seeks to do is if you separate the reporting process from the addressing process, it goes to a federal hotline. And now, guess what? They can't hide that. They can't sweep it under the rug. That organization is, and now the hotline is going to report it to the organization. So the child calls the hotline reports that, records it, and then they turn it over to the organization who should be addressing it. It could be a school, church, league. Now, that abuse can no longer be swept under the rug. And you know what? People seem to be more responsible when they're being watched. If they think nobody's watching, they sometimes don't do what they should. But if they know it's been reported elsewhere, it's going to put pressure on them to address that abuse. So that's the first thing this hotline does. Very simple, low fruit.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. Yep. Thanks.
The second part of this
Stop button's going to be down
hotline
in the corner.
is it actually reports statistics on the hotspots of where this abuse is coming from. So let's say that the child from the church is being abused, and they report the abuse to the hotline. Now the hotline is going to report statistics that there was an abuse, not names, not those kind of details, just statistics. That we're getting a whole lot of reports of abuse coming from this organization, this group, this league, whatever. What that's going to do is it's going to put public pressure on organizations to train adults on how to recognize and address abuse. Do organizations currently want to train adults working with youth on how to recognize and address abuse? No. And you ask why? Because, again, it's back to the attorneys. It's a liability. I spent almost 2 years meeting with church leaders trying to get them to adopt policy that would help adults recognize and address abuse. They flat out refused. The attorney came in. It was all attorney guided. Yeah. Why? Because if you have a policy that says you're supposed to do this, this, and this when you see abuse, and then one of your adults does not follow that policy, right? Now it goes to the court. Now the victims can say, look, and their attorney can say, look, they didn't even follow their own written policy. So it increases the liability risk for an organization to have a written policy that shows how to address and correct abuse. So with these statistics being published, it's going to encourage. Now you're going to have some public relations influence on top, mixed with the legal concerns, to encourage more organizations to train adults to recognize and address abuse. The third part of this hotline, and we're almost done here, is let's suppose the organization, after it's been reported to them, they just flat out refuse to do anything. And you think, well, does that occur? Yeah, it does. Did you know that to this day, our church still has not investigated or addressed the abuse that ended in my son's end-of-life decision? Refused. And you ask, why would they not do that? Because their own investigation could uncover their own negligence. So the organizational attorneys are going to say, do no investigation, because you might expose your own negligence. Don't do it. So there is no investigation. We've not had an investigation for our son. So now the third part of this hotline is, let's suppose that the organization, like what happened to us, did not address the abuse, did not correct anybody. We can call back to this hotline and let them know that they're not addressing this abuse. And they can publish these statistics that this organization has had so many claims of not addressing abuse. So now it does those three simple things. We're not forcing anybody to do anything. We're simply reporting and shining lights on. Now, let's suppose that you're a parent and you're going to maybe drop your child off in the care of organization A, B, or C. These statistics that are published by this hotline will give you a place to go and see just how safe that organization is. And let's say you go and look on the statistics and you find that, hey, they've got a lot of serious abuse and they're not addressing that abuse. What are you going to do as a parent? How many of you are going to say, good, this is great, let's drop our children off here? You're going to say, no, we're not going to drop our children off here. Kind of like what's that phone app or the advertising app where you can grade different businesses, right? And you can make comments. What is it called?
Yelp.
Yelp. It's kind of like Yelp, or even on Lyft or Uber, right? If you don't like what they're doing, you can leave a bad review, and maybe we're not going to go back there, right? What this hotline does is it gives victims a place to give a bad review, so other parents don't go back there, and that's going to put pressure on these organizational leaders to adopt policy that will help adults recognize and address abuse. And that, in a nutshell, is what we're trying to achieve. We've tried to keep it low fruit. We're not forcing anybody to do anything. All we're doing is shining lights, and we're giving a place, the safest place with the less embarrassment as possible to call. This place is geared for children. so that they're able to, they can get over the barriers that maybe my son was not able to overcome. You know, in time, we will look back and wonder collectively how we allowed our children to be abused for so long. How we allowed the advice of attorneys, not safety, and mental health professionals to guide policy. Today, each of you have a decision to make. Will you look away while knowing children are being harmed, knowing there's bad policy, not just in churches, but in organizations in general, the legal landscape? Today, I ask you to help us create the needed laws and policy that will make our children safer, our society a much more beautiful place. Thank you for coming out today.